It's a couple moments after 6, so let's get rolling. I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Cal Workman. I'm with the Manchester Community Library, and I'm so pleased that you're sharing some of this absolutely perfect day and evening with us to learn about composting, something that is a requirement in the state of Vermont, but there's a lot to it, much more than meets the eye. With us this evening, who's going to walk us through everything, is Abigail Virkler from nearby Danby. She has gone through rigorous training, over 7 weeks of intensive training to learn everything there is to learn about composting. And she also can really speak from experience. She's learned a lot by doing on her family farm. And I think she will show you a picture in her presentation of her composter, and it's really quite magnificent. But we don't need to have one quite like Abigail's to succeed at composting. But she's going to walk us through, and with that, I will say welcome and take it away, Abigail. Thanks.
Well, thank you and welcome everybody. I'm glad to be here and I'm glad that you all are as well. Can you all see that? Mm-hmm. All right, so here we go. In this presentation, I will be talking about, we'll be talking about 3 basic things. First, why we should be waste conscious. Then we'll cover the benefits of composting, and last, we'll talk about the how-tos of composting so that it can be easy and enjoyable for you. So here I have a picture of an apple core, and my question for you all is, what is an apple core? Is it trash? Is it a valuable resource? This is worthy of consideration because here you can see Vermont's trash a few years ago, and as you can see, about 50% of the waste could have been recycled or composted, perhaps even more. We have paper, plastic, organics, glass, and metal. All these things are going into the trash, and they don't need to be. Mm-hmm. I'll be getting into some of those reasons in a few minutes here. We should pay attention to this for a few reasons that I'm going to go over quick. Landfill space in Vermont is limited and running out. There's not enough room for all of the trash that people are throwing away. And that's part of what made the Vermont state start to consider how can we reduce our waste. There's also concerns for climate change. Landfills are anaerobic systems, so they release methane, which is a greenhouse gas, and it's about 34 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. So it's also a huge waste of resources. I mean, from seed to store, and then we just throw it away. And Vermonters produce about 4.5 pounds of trash every day, and 14% of the people in the state are food insecure. So how can we balance this out better and make sure that the food can go around in a better way, I guess, is the question. Act 148 was unanimously passed in 2012 with 2 goals in mind: to reduce the total waste disposed and to increase recycling and composting. The last part of this law went into effect on July 1st of last year. That's what we call the Universal Composting and Recycling Law. And here we have some more statistics. Here you can see how much we could save by recycling paper. And then these graphics are really kind of sobering to think about next time you throw away food. How many minutes you could spend in a shower for every amount of food that gets thrown away. 5 minutes for a pound of tomatoes, 42 minutes for a pound of bananas, a whole hour for a pound of white rice, 90 minutes for 4 ounces of chocolate, and it gets even scarier. We have 122 minutes, which is more than 2 hours for a pound of cheese, and 370 minutes for a pound of beef. And that's how much water is getting wasted when we throw away our food. As Vermonters, what can we do about this? Here is the Vermont food recovery hierarchy, showing the ways that we would like to be reducing waste. And it starts at the top with source reduction, most preferred, preventing food waste in the first place. Feeding people is also good. A lot of donation programs are out there getting out to those 14% of hungry Vermonters. If there's food that can't be consumed by people because it's been opened or whatever, then you can feed it to animals. Composting and anaerobic digestion for the rest. And last, we can process food for energy recovery, like producing biogas, that sort of thing. And so I'd like to talk for a couple of minutes about the 5 concepts of zero waste. They all start with R. Refuse is the first one. In other words, don't get anything you don't need. Keep track of what you have. This poster here that I have is from World War I. I think it says it well as to how we can be refusing or reducing our food waste. You're probably familiar with the next 3, reduce, reuse, and recycle. And then the last R is rot or composting. This background picture is a zero waste station I worked at a couple years ago. And yeah, I guess get used to seeing 3 containers instead of 1 as we learn how to do this. All right, so that's that for zero waste. This slide does tie into zero waste, I guess, a little bit, but this is just some of the benefits of composting that there are. Feeding people, reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that I mentioned, supporting green jobs with haulers and food rescue and that sort of thing. Compost restores soil, and I'll be getting onto that, I think, in the very next slide. And then reducing the need for landfills that I already mentioned as our landfills are filling up. And then this just shows how much of a difference it's possible to make in Vermont if we would compost all of our food scraps, which is a very lofty goal, but we could, just in the state of Vermont, reduce as much greenhouse gas emissions as driving around the earth 4,629 times. So that's a lot of methane. Here's where I was going to talk about the benefits of compost. This is very much a dictionary definition that I have up here. Composting is about recycling organic material back into nature. When humans work to manage decomposition, that is composting. One thing to remember is that no matter what your soil type is, compost will improve it. In loose, sandy soils, compost helps to retain the water. Normally, the water just runs through the sandy soils, and compost helps to retain that somewhat through making aggregates, which are groups of particles that allow plant roots to penetrate the soil easier. Your plants grow better and bigger. The more aggregates you have in your soil, the looser, easier to cultivate it will be. And then in clay or silt soil, where the soil is, there's a lot of tightly bound particles. Sometimes roots have a hard time spreading. Water has a hard time draining. It tends to pool on the surface. There's not as much air. Again, compost will improve that. Same thing with the formation of aggregates. Compost also supplies plants with nutrients, and it helps store them for long-term availability. Also, it promotes biological diversity and naturally suppresses diseases. There's also, and this is a bit complicated, but something known as the cation exchange capacity. Basically, it makes more nutrients available to the plants. It's a fascinating process. And at last, we're going to get into the how-tos of composting. First, your location, and don't brush this one off. It's important to consider some things to help you actually be able to enjoy compost and to be able to do it easily. Access. Is it easy to get to, especially in the winter? I mean, we like convenience. It's hard to do something when it's not convenient for us. Then there's aesthetics. Some people don't mind looking at a composter, but if you do, maybe you should hide it behind something or paint it or consider what you want to be looking at. Drainage, you don't want to be putting your bin where water pools under a rooftop where there's water that could run into it, that kind of thing. Weather ties into that somewhat. I mean, can you get to it in the rain or snow? Back to access maybe a bit. A lot of people ask us about sun versus shade. And for this, I can say, if your pile is in full sun, it's probably going to dry out more. But as long as you have wet enough food scraps, it's probably going to be okay. If it's in the shade, it probably won't get hot enough to decompose quickly. So finding a nice location where it can have some sun and some shade is nice. You also have to think about neighbors. Can your neighbors see it, and are they okay with it? We always encourage people, be open up front. Hey, tell me if it smells. This is my plan for managing animals. And maybe your neighbor even wants to contribute to your pile, and that's great too. So there are lots of composting methods out here. Here are just a few of the more common ones. There you can have a pile on the ground. We did this for years. We still do with our cow manure and bedding. It's super simple, easy to turn, but it is hard to get your greens covered. As you can see, these people have a lot of food scraps hanging out of their compost, which isn't ideal. But another simple option is to dig a trench in your garden and fill. It'll be ready to plant in next year. Then there's a few bin options. A 3-bin system works really well. We'll get to that in a few slides because that's what our family uses. Then here's a couple single bin options. The one drawback of single bins is that you have to empty them at some point, because when they fill up and they're not composted yet, you need to have somewhere else to put them. That same principle is with tumblers when they get full. Tumblers are easy, but they could freeze up in the winter, so you can keep them in your garage or something. Again, you'll need somewhere to dump that when they get full. The soil saver that you can see here is convenient because you can empty it from the bottom and keep filling it up. There are others of this style out there. The soil saver brand is popular and trustworthy. And don't be disappointed if your finished compost doesn't look like that picture. A few other options that I don't have pictures of include the green cone, which is buried partway under the ground and it spreads nutrients into the surrounding soil. It doesn't actually produce compost. You use it more like fertilizer for that area that it's in. And you can compost meat and bones in those too. There's also some people have electric countertop composters that dehydrate your food basically. And then you can put it somewhere else to break down in your garden or feed it to your chickens. The one I'm most familiar with is the food cycler. Seems to be pretty reliable if you like that kind of option. And then there's vermicomposting, which I'll talk to you about that in a minute. And then the last one is bokashi. That's an interesting method. Another one you can do in your house if worms don't appeal to you. You basically, with a special bokashi starter, ferment your food scraps. It's fairly simple and it produces a wonderful, it is acidic, but a substance that you can use in your garden. And as far as buying bins, I will say that one place to get them is your local solid waste district. You'll get bins of good quality and reputation from them. There are many independent vendors and DIY options if you're that type. One thing I will say is that there have been a lot of shortages since COVID, especially at the solid waste districts and with some of the more popular brands like the Soil Saver. So you might want to keep that in mind or plan ahead. And then I have a whole slide here on vermicomposting because I think it's a very good option. You can do it indoors. It's a great project. Children love it. They live in a bin. You can, again, make it yourself or purchase one. And you can have them in your garage or your kitchen. As you can see from this top left picture here, you can even put them outside if the weather is nice. The worms that you need to use are called red wigglers, and you can buy them. You can also get them from a vermicomposting friend. They do reproduce, and you need to, unless you're going to expand your bin, you need to find a place for them to go. And they eat their body weight in food each day, so that's a very good option. However, they don't eat everything. You'll need to do your research and then also have some other option for what to do with the rest of your food scraps that they can't eat. Most of these pictures are from Linda. She's a master composting friend of mine. This is her bin right here. Here's another bin. This is a bucket type of option. And then this is her food and bedding ready to go in the new worm bin. She tells me her worms are getting smarter because she feeds them crossword puzzles. And down here you can see worms and old bedding getting ready to be fed. And you can see on the far left here the very black nutrient-rich dirt that's down there ready to go in your garden. So back to general composting. What do you compost? There are two types of materials. We call them greens and browns. So greens tend to be wetter and nitrogen-rich. They include things like food scraps, fresh plants, manure, your leftovers. I mean, you can put any food product in, except they recommend not putting in meat and bones, but I'll touch on that in the next slide. And then there's browns. They tend to be drier and carbon-rich. Browns include dry plants, hay, wood chips and shavings, shredded paper and cardboard if you want. And I will say, as far as materials, particle size really matters. Wood chips add extra air to the pile, which is great, but they won't decompose as well. And I would say that they aren't sufficient as the only brown source for that very reason. On the other hand, sawdust tends to mat, and that can create a stagnant pile with not enough air going around. So do vary your browns. Chopping up your food scraps can help them break down faster. You can also add soil if you want to introduce more minerals and prepare your garden for compost use. Also, a couple of storing tips. You can store your food scraps for a time period in the freezer. A lot of people do that if they bring their food scraps to the transfer station or set it out for pickup, but you can do that too for home composting. And as far as browns, make them very convenient. A pile, we have a pile right next to our compost bin so that we can just add them every time. And you can also store like leaves and other dry things in trash cans over the winter, so you can get to them easily. The right carbon to nitrogen ratio is critical for proper decomposition and avoiding odors in animals. So having 3 times as much carbon or brown products to every green or nitrogen product is the key. And yeah, here you can see a bucket of food scraps ready to go in with another bucket of browns that, yeah, you cover up your greens if possible. It's very easy to measure if you have a pail. As far as things not to put in your pile, invasive or diseased plants, weed seeds, recyclables, pet feces, meat and bones, they recommend not doing that for home composters just because it attracts so many more animals. If you're going to do that, at least bury them. And meat and bones is continued to be allowed in the trash in Vermont. The one thing that they let people put in if necessary. Flowers contain fungicides, which is going to slow your microbial life. And of course, other chemicals are going to have ill effects on your pile also. And then watch the little contaminants like fruit and vegetable stickers that come off. And keep building your pile and wait for compost. Here I have a few things for you to consider during this waiting process as you continue to build your pile and wait for compost. Moisture content, you don't need to worry about this necessarily, but if you do squeeze a handful of your compost, it should yield a few drops of water. You don't want a sopping wet pile, but if it's too dry, again, things can't happen. And it varies by stage too. And winter moisture is good. Just let it snow on your pile and keep adding onto the top. Your pile isn't going to decompose in the winter unless you have what we call a hot composting system, which is not what I'm talking about today. So just keep layering your greens and browns, wait till the spring. Your pile also needs oxygen. If you don't turn your pile, which aerates it, it's even more important to have air holes in your system. Turning it will speed up the process. Tumblers use this principle. You crank it every time you add your food scraps and browns. And also some methods which are such as our 3-bin system. I'll get to that in a few minutes. Lots of creatures are good. You want larger decomposers such as centipedes, beetles, and worms. The unseen bacteria and fungi do a lot of the decomposition. And that's why I mentioned not putting in chemicals and things like that that could harm that life. And then don't worry if some things in the pile haven't broken down still. It's pretty normal to still have some eggshells or pieces of wood when your compost is pretty much done. You can sift them out and put them back in your new pile to finish. And you know your compost is ready when it's crumbly, moist, and earthy smelling. You can use it right away or store it. Then I'd like to take a few minutes to address a big concern, and that's animals. The 3-to-1 ratio is very important. 3 times as many browns as greens, and that will avoid bad odors. And when you don't have odors, you're not going to have as many animals. You definitely don't want to see this picture that I have here on the right, because not only will the bear continue visiting your bin, he'll visit your neighbors, and it can create a lot of issues. Also, keeping the browns on top, like I mentioned, very important to keep all of that stuff that they actually want covered up. You may want to get a bear-proof bin too. The green cone is supposed to be bear-proof, and I've seen like some DIY options or different things you can do to keep those larger or smaller animals out of your compost. To keep out mice or small animals, you can use 1/4-inch hardware cloth on the bottom of your bin, and then make sure there isn't any spaces bigger than that on the top and sides. I don't worry too much about the small animals. I mean, they tunnel through your pile and add air to it, but at the same time, you really don't want them reproducing a lot. Our family has never had animal issues, even without a top or bottom. But that doesn't mean you won't. And prevention is definitely better than trying to get rid of something, especially if it starts involving more people. So if a bear, dog, or other animal keeps visiting your pile, review the suggestions I have here on the screen. There's a link to what the state has to say about controlling bears and other animals like that. And this is our family's 3-bin system. The first thing is the bin. This bin works really well. You can see the front slats can be removed so that it's easy to turn your pile. We start layering in the first bin on the left, transfer it to the second bin when it gets full, and keep going like that. And if you time it right, finished compost will come out of the last bin when you're ready to transfer, and then you can keep filling up the first one again. And then you can use a system like that. Even if your family isn't as big as ours, you can just turn it when it gets half full or something like that. This size, I think these bins are about 3 by 3 by 3, or maybe 4 by 4 by 4, somewhere in there. That's a very good size as far as breaking down your pile without it getting too hot. And then you add your scraps or greens. Our scraps don't look very green in that picture, but then you add your browns on the top of it. And the last step is to wait even through winter. You can see a snow-covered pile that we're going to keep adding onto. And then here's how to use your finished compost. You can mix it with soil 50-50 for use in your garden or lawn, transplanting and potting, or as mulch. It's definitely useful stuff. Anywhere you think dirt, think compost, I guess. I already mentioned sifting. I think it's a good idea, especially if you're using it for your young plants, to have finer soil for them. There are lots of make your own sifters out there. At least pick out the larger chunks and put them back in your old pile. And remove contaminants, obviously, if you missed a sticker or something like that. And if you can't compost, there are other options for you in Vermont. You can feed your food scraps to animals if you have them. It's probably a good idea to do your research first. I know pigs aren't supposed to eat anything that touched meat. You can also join like a community gardening or a composting setup. There's a lot of those out there. You can ask your neighbors that are composting. Ask on Front Porch Forum. See if somebody wants to take your scraps. You can also drop them off at your transfer station. Some transfer stations do charge. Ask your local one and see what they say about it. And you can set them out with your trash if you get pickup. Haulers for trash and recycling are required to offer it, but it's often for a fee. There are more and more people doing private pickup services. It can be costly, but it's another great option. It's supporting a local business. I think it's very interesting what these haulers are doing. And there are other things you can do to divert your food scraps. I mean, if you want help with your options, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I can help you find something that's easy and affordable and what you would like. And that's that. So thank you. I hope you have gained some greater understanding of why and how to compost. This page I have a few resources on, some solid waste management districts websites, PDFs with great info, the Master Composter program, which I would highly recommend to anyone interested in learning more about this. It costs $50 and it's 7 weeks, and it's been a really great experience. Zero waste and recycling info and more that I hope can help you in the future. And then my contact information if you would like to get back with me about anything. So yeah, thanks again. And I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Yeah, well, great. Thank you so much, Abigail. That is incredible. In fact, I'm wondering maybe what we can do is take some of your resources and send them out to people following the event, because there really is so much there. Yeah, we have a bunch of questions here. And let's see, let's get rolling. We've got a comment here of someone who's going to be starting a garden. And so you're helping people get right underway. Okay, this is my questions. Can you put plants with their roots in the compost, or should roots be separated from their host plant?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't usually I wouldn't necessarily put anything with roots in unless it's already dead. Like, we would pull up our plants in the garden, leave them sit out a couple days, and by then the roots are kind of dead, and then you throw them in and it's fall anyway. So then over the winter, they kind of sit there. And it's fine. I mean, if you do have some things growing out of your compost pile, it's not a big deal.
And you did mention something about well, I'll just speak from my experience. My compost doesn't necessarily completely break down, but
Mhm.
I have just the one bin. Is it okay to kind of put mostly composted material in the garden? I kind of figure
Mhm.
it'll finish breaking down once it's out there.
Yeah, it can, for sure.
Okay. Or
I
either,
wouldn't worry too much about breaking it down just for home composting use. But like I said, if you're putting it on plants, you don't want big stuff that could disrupt their roots.
yeah. Well, great. Is everybody that is here this evening, are we all already composting, or, um, it still is very new, I think, to many people. And even the notion of curbside pickup, I'm not sure I've seen that down in this area. Um, but I know that we do have, at least in my community, and I'm in Dorset, we do have the transit station. You can bring your compost there.
Mhm.
Uh, uh, we have a question. What kind of woods are good for the compost bin system? When you talk about browns, could you talk about wood?
I don't think it matters at all. Um, what kind of wood goes in there. As far as like the wood to build the actual bin out of, though, there are some woods that would do better than others, and I can't remember specifically what they are.
Hmm.
As far as like some woods actually might start to break down if you have them in your as a compost bin for a while.
Hmm. So what would be your advice for someone just starting out? What would be, step one, two, three? Do these three things just to get you going. You need something in your kitchen, probably, to capture your scraps, right?
Mm-hmm. I don't know. Again, it depends a lot on the specific what kind of location they have, what kind of method they want to use.
Hmm. Hmm.
But do think through it and don't just decide, oh, I'll try out this for a while. Um, it seems like the people that are more successful are the ones that are thinking through it and saying, this is step 1, 2, and 3 for me.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. And it doesn't matter if you have, an abundance of one thing. If you are eating, I don't know, avocados and or you eat 4 eggs a day and you have a family, does it tip the balance too much if you have too much of one kind of thing that's going out there with your food scraps? I'm thinking primarily. And then also different times of the year. In the autumn you can get leaves. In the spring it's something different. You don't have the dry
Mm-hmm.
leaves. You're
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think for most home composters that it would be possible to offset the balance too much. I mean, if you really want to get into it, there's issues like pH. Some foods have a much higher pH, and therefore your compost will come out that way. I
Mhm,
know some companies that are doing like composting whey and things in really big scales, and they have to watch that kind of thing.
mhm.
But I don't think that that would be an issue for a small composter.
Mm. Do you think it's possible to have compost within one season? I mean, in Vermont, and
Hmm.
if you have the right location, more or
Yeah,
less, little sun, little shade.
if your pile is big enough, that's a big thing. I mean, they say 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet as a cube. That's like the minimum for getting your compost hot. And then, of course, the hotter it is, the sooner it's going to break down.
Hmm.
So
That's great. Well, are there other questions? Do you mind if people unmute? If there's, I don't want to, does anybody else have any other questions for Abigail?
there's one in here about hardware cloth leaching out bad metals. I hadn't heard that before, um, but I would be interested in looking that up since that's what they say, hardware cloth. I don't know if they make it all out of the same stuff or if it's possible to get something different. I'm not sure about that one. So sorry, Karen.
Mm. Ah, yeah, I've heard someone has a comment here about, as for making bins out of wood, I've heard not to use pressure
Hmm.
treated. Yes.
Yes, I would agree with that one.
Yeah. Well, I was really surprised to hear you say flowers from a florist. That was very new to me too. I didn't realize they might have something on them that's not so desirable. But other flowers, if you're deadheading
Hmm.
flowers, that's fine.
Hmm.
Daffodils, whatnot. Okay,
Hmm.
that's great. Well, do we all feel ready to compost?
So if they're green, then that's considered a green, obviously. And then if they're dry, then they're brown. And I've heard of people, they take all their grass clippings and store them over winter so that they can use that for the browns.
Hmm.
So if you don't want them on your lawn, there's options. So it actually, when I was studying this stuff in the Master Composter program, there's actually an ideal temperature graph that changes throughout the process. So it is actually very technical. But I'm thinking at some point that it would get up to 150 degrees, and then I had to stay that way for a few days. So yeah, if you are checking your compost with a compost thermometer, I would say at least 150 degrees.
Anybody else? Are you ready to compost? Yes. I think we need a book though, Abigail. I think we need you to write us a book and, specific to Vermont too, because I do think we do have concerns. There's a lot, I hear a lot of people who are concerned about the animals and attracting bears.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really great that you're taking note of the special considerations, where you place your composter, maybe, thinking about your neighbors and what is it going to look like. And,
Mm-hmm.
some people,
Mm-hmm.
they're not big fans of these giant bins, but there's some ways to make friends with it, I think,
Yeah. And a lot of the material on this presentation, like I've been doing this kind of thing for a couple of years now. So I was kind of basing it off of what people have as questions and the kind of concerns that they do have. So I hope that that was applicable for you all.
Well, anybody else? Anyone else have other questions or?
Well, I'm sure you could grind them up. As far as putting whole meat or bones in your compost, though, that can really be an animal attractor. And we do that at our home. So I'm not going to tell anybody not to do it. It works for us, but that's just the state recommendation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think burying them pretty deeply could help too.
Mm-hmm. I have a fun tip to pass along that a friend of mine got a secondhand blender from, a yard sale, and she used that to grind up stuff in the kitchen. So it was sort of fast forwarding some of this breakdown of the food scraps. And then when she put that in her compost, she was ahead. I think. Yeah. Well, everyone, unless there are more questions, I think we're ready to give this a whirl. Or I feel better about what I'm doing, certainly, and I hope you do as well. I'm going to keep eating my eggs and tossing them out there and not worrying about the combination, but we'll start making sure I peel off the labels from my avocados and bananas. The garden doesn't like them.
Any, like I was mentioning with Cal earlier, I think about corn cobs, bigger things like that. They don't break down as fast, but there's nothing wrong with putting them in your compost. A lot of people would chop them up. I mean, cut your lemon into 3 pieces, that kind of thing. And then it's perfectly fine to put in your compost and it will break down eventually.
And so do you just wait till everything has really broken down completely? Or can you sort of nudge it out and put it in the garden with sort of mostly composted citrus, which
you could do either. Yeah.
All right. Are we all set, folks? I think we're ready to compost. And thank you, Abigail, so much for sharing your knowledge.
Well, thanks all for coming, and I hope you start composting if you're not already, or can do it better. Something, yeah.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Bye.